Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp audio network. Check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or on social media. It's always at SafeCamp Audio. On this week's episode, we continue our summer of SafeCamp Spotlights with Angela Orkin, co-host of the Children's Law Podcast, alongside John and Jim Walsh. The Children's Law Podcast is really terrific and in a big way is responsible for the creation of SafeCamp, because I was listening to the show one day and thought, man, I bet not enough people listen to this show. It's a really terrific program that they do. I just sort of stumbled into it when I saw Angela's booth at a conference, and that's really what made me think, how do people find out about all of the really interesting stuff that's going on in the audio space when it comes to issues like child welfare and family supports and juvenile justice and all that? There's really still no juvenile justice content. We'll work on that. Speaking of Angela and conferences, both her and I will be at the National Association of Counsel for Children conference from August 10th to 12th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if you're at the conference or in the area, come say hi. I'm hoping to record a few guest interviews myself while I'm there. I got a few tentatively lined up, and NACC was kind enough to give us, me and Angela, respectively, a little podcast room for that purpose. Before we get to my conversation with Angela, let's run down a few headlines in child welfare and youth justice. We'll start off with some brand new, hot off the press today data from the Department of Justice about substance use by youth in juvenile facilities. The report, which was done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, used data collected at three different points, 2008 through 9, then 2012 and 2018. And it all has to do with youth reported use of drugs. And of course, as the title would suggest, it's just all youth who have experienced incarceration in juvenile facilities. So let's start with maybe the one piece of good news in this, I guess. When you compare reported use from the first data collection point in 08-09 to 2018, there are significantly more youth in the recent collection who report never using drugs. It's 15% in 2018 versus 9% in 2008-09. So following the logic that working with a young person in any regard is probably easier if drugs and drinking aren't a factor, that's good. But the big picture here is that 84% of youth in juvenile facilities report having ever used drugs, and 60% use them in a way that is consistent with the DSM manual's definition of a substance use disorder. 36% drink in a way consistent with the definition of a drinking disorder. I will link to where you can get into all of the ways that this data has been cross-tabbed. You can really geek out if you want. They broke it down by race, ethnicity, age, region of the country, gender identity, types of offenses, and other stuff. A few numbers and trends, though, that have jumped out and I wanted to kind of call attention to. First, females make up a smaller piece of the juvenile incarceration pie as compared to males by a long shot, but report significantly more drug use. 72% of females reported use consistent with a drug disorder, compared with 59% of males, for example. The reported use of heroin among females was 17%, which is incredible and more than double the male reported use. 53% of females reported using medications, and that's a wide range from opiates to inhalants and cough syrup, compared with 40% of males. So there's far less females than males incarcerated in juvenile facilities in this country. But it does seem from the reported use surveys here that they aggregated from these 3 data points that reported drug use and problematic drug use, if you go by the DSM definition, is very prevalent among female offenders who find themselves in juvenile facilities. Second one, Native American youth. About 9 in 10 American Indian or Alaska Native youth in juvenile facilities met the criteria for substance use disorder, and more than 6 in 10 met the criteria for a severe substance use disorder, and that's just heartbreaking. Final one, authors looked at reported use by most serious offense type using 4 different buckets: person offenses, which is everything murder, rape, robbery, assault; property crimes; drug offenses; and then other, and other was a catch-all for like status offenses, parole or probation violations, curfew. The group with the least reported drug use was, surprisingly, at least to me as a layman, those youth sentenced for person offenses, which again, those are the offenses that we all typically view as the most severe because it's individual victims: homicide, murder, rape, assaults. That was the group that was the least likely to report, I suppose, use of drugs. Not shockingly, the youth who were in juvenile facilities for offenses related to drug offenses had the highest. So this report was accompanied by a press release, but really was presented without any comment or analysis by the Justice Department. We'll see if there's further discussion of it from the Biden administration after it's been out there for a while, or if members of Congress interested in juvenile justice want to take it up, maybe consider some sort of policy response to what is reported here. You would think with all of the federal money that goes into child welfare and the prevention of abuse and neglect, there would be some pretty sharp, clear lines defining the playing field. Not the case. There's actually not a real specific federal definition of abuse or neglect in federal law. It just describes, and this I think comes from the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act from decades ago, what maltreatment cumulatively is. And here's just some direct takeaways from the federal definition: any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. So as I said, it's a cumulative definition of maltreatment. They don't deign in federal law to really kind of parse the two or define them by characteristics. Representative Gwen Moore has taken a crack at getting specific about defining out what neglect isn't. She wants federal legislation that makes clear that poverty in and of itself cannot be a driver of families into the child welfare system. The Family Poverty is Not Child Neglect Act, which in previous years has been attached to efforts to reauthorize the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, was reintroduced last week, and Moore told the imprint's Michael Fitzgerald for a story that I will link to, quote, "I know firsthand that in child welfare cases where poverty is the only issue causing hardship, children benefit from remaining with their families and accessing the resources they need." Staying with the nation's capital for a second, 2 interesting pieces of job news in the Biden administration. One I totally missed last month. Sherry Lackman, who is a former foster youth that founded the organization Foster America, stepped down from her post as the Associate Director for Education, Income Maintenance, and Labor at Biden's Office of Management and Budget. It's a long title, but really it's a influential position where you are at the kind of seat of power for determining spending priorities within family support, among other things. Lackman's new job is also very interesting. She'll be the head of social impact for OpenAI, which is the nonprofit involved in the development of ChatGPT. It's a major player in the burgeoning AI sector. Lackman will be the head of social impact for OpenAI, and I'd say it's a pretty good thing to have someone with a nuanced view of child welfare in that position. As we talked to Carol Hussey on the podcast about recently, AI and machine learning is certainly going to have a place and a say in the child welfare field and juvenile justice workforce very soon, if it isn't already in your system. And joining the Biden administration in a very high-pressure role is Allison Blake, former head of the New Jersey child welfare system, who has served as a senior fellow for the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So Blake will be leading the Unaccompanied Children's Program at the Administration on Children and Families, which is really the only direct foster care service operated by the federal government. We talk a lot about federal influence on child welfare. It's often and almost entirely done through carrots and sticks with a lot of money going out the door with requirements for spending that money. But this is directly operated by the Administration on Children and Families. In a nutshell, what they largely serve are young people from Central America or from other non-contiguous countries, so not Mexico and Canada, who arrive at the border in search of asylum. They're seeking asylum. They're apprehended at the border. Unlike other border cases, there's just a different policy path for how this works. Customs and Border Patrol will be the ones who apprehend the youth typically, but they have 72 hours to transfer custody of the youth into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. So Health and Human Services, through the Unaccompanied Children's Program, then has to find safe shelter for the child while they go and find a sponsor for that child in the community. And the preference is to put them with a relative, whether it's a parent that's already living in the United States or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent who's here. But basically what happens is the youth lives in the Unaccompanied Children's Program. When we see an enormous spike in the number of kids who show up alone at the border, that's when you start to see huge shelters down there, big, military bases full of kids, or them converting a Target superstore that went out of business into a shelter. More typically, youth are placed either in specialized foster care programs, I guess. Well, I would say the most common response is kind of like more residential care. Think group homes, think residential programs in the United States that are geared towards working with them. They'll stay there while sponsors are identified and vetted. They're supposed to be providing education, food, shelter, all that. So obviously, as is anything on the border these days, it's a pretty controversial corner of the world. And now that will be Allison Blake's job to manage. A few new experiments in cash assistance as child welfare strategy. The imprint has stories on all three of these that I'm going to mention, so I will quickly go over them, but post the story links in the show notes. First one is a national 5-site pilot project that is going to be led by Point Source for Youth, which is based in New York City, that will test the use of upfront cash assistance to help youth avoid homelessness due to some immediate or looming crisis. So as Sarah Tiano reports in her story about this whole thing was born of a similar venture in Washington state where young people were supplied flexible grants that they could use for really just about anything that would get them out of homelessness in a 30-day window. So that's one. The other two relate to parents who are involved in the child welfare system. So the Mothers Outreach Network in Washington, D.C. is going to provide a $500 a month funding for 3 years through its cash assistance program. It's called Mother Up. 5 mothers have already begun receiving the assistance that just started a couple months ago, and the plan is to eventually support 50 families through this program. So the eligibility, by the way, for that is parents who have already become involved with CPS or the child welfare agency there, but still have their kids living with them. New York State is doing a similar program, 150 households there, $500 a month, same as DC, but this one will be just for 1 year. And the pilot's target population there are households who are eligible to receive a differential response to Child Protective Services reports that have been accepted by the New York State Central Registry. So in other words, cases where a report has been made, there has not been deemed a present and pressing safety issue, but the family is known to CPS to the extent that the Central Registry is aware of it and differential responses on the table. So both of those test whether or not basic income can suppress future or deepening involvement in child welfare for parents who are already known to the system but haven't had a child removed into care. I was reminded reading up on the latter two of those tests, the ones for parents, of our interview on the podcast with Dee Wilson, who writes the Sounding Board monthly newsletter. Spent a lot of time working in Washington State's child welfare system. During our conversation, he talked a lot about his ideas for making basic income a significant part of the reunification process. And I do think that would be a worthy experiment for somebody to take on, because it would expand the body of research from way upstream. Does cash just help avoid child welfare outright? Think about child tax credits. To preventing removals. That is something that perhaps we'll learn about from this New York State and DC experiment. And then, does cash assistance help drive towards reunification? I think it's pretty significant to maybe find that out, because I think it was 2017 or 2018, the exits to reunification from foster care nationally dropped below 50% for the first time. It's now at 47%. It has not crossed back over the 50% mark since that time. Last thing for this week, it's a piece in Vox, bit of a mix of analysis and opinion I thought was interesting and wanted to talk about. It's entitled, How Abortion Bans Will Strain an Already Failing Foster System. And I saw this getting shared quite a bit and wanted to outline a few reasons why I think the foundation of this piece might be a little problematic. I'll link to the full piece, though, so anyone can read, judge for themselves. Hit us up, tips@imprintnews.org if you have thoughts. But here's just a few excerpts I'm going to read that sort of sum up the thesis here. And I'm quoting from the piece now. As more infants are likely born to financially struggling parents in the wake of Dobbs, the foster care system will continue to be touted as a potential solution, as it was in the beginning of the opioid epidemic. Even before Dobbs, the foster care system was already strained and under-resourced. It's easy to fall back on imagining that more funding and more foster parents are the most urgent priority to prepare for surging numbers of neglected children. And the piece continues, but nearly everyone that Vox spoke with who works within the system thinks that foster care isn't the answer and that the current child welfare system is one that traps families in poverty and then penalizes them for it. Even when the system functions at its best, separation is still a traumatic experience that can affect both the parent and the child for the rest of their lives. 9 out of 10 women who are denied an abortion want to raise their child despite the hardships. Refusing them this opportunity damages communities and propagates a pattern of discrimination that harms the most vulnerable families. So it is certainly true that abortion bans will most severely impact low-income women in certain states. And it is also true that poverty puts any parent at heightened risk of involvement with the child welfare system. There's really no debate there. There are certainly people who would argue whether the extent to which poverty directly drives foster care removals as opposed to being a part and parcel factor or whatever. But there's really no debate that if you are a poor parent in America, you are much more likely to become involved with the child welfare system. But I think the argument in this Vox piece first conflates foster care with adoption a little bit. I don't think anyone is really out there saying foster care is a potential solution to the fact that babies will be born to moms who would prefer an abortion. The full sentence of that feeling, if it exists, would be, well, we'll just wait until these moms get accused of abuse and neglect and then take them into foster care. It's no problem. Further, the assertion that foster care was touted as a solution, those are the words in the piece, to the opioid crisis really doesn't ring true. It was certainly true that foster care use shot up during the 2010s because of the opioid crisis, but even the hyperlinked op-ed in this Vox piece is to a really great column about how that is because the system was poorly prepared with other options like community-based or family residential drug treatment. So in the opioid epidemic, it was not like, oh, foster care is a great solution. It was the solution that occurred because, as this op-ed that they linked to points out, they weren't ready with other tools or not nearly enough. Now, I do think there are many people who believe that adoption, and by that I mean private adoptions facilitated by moms, will be some sort of solution or whatever you want to call it in regard to the post-Dobbs era. But while there's evidence that there have been fewer abortions this year, there's really no evidence yet that adoptions have skyrocketed as a result. But to be fair, I think that anything like this, you got to give it more than a one-year tail to see what is happening, in my opinion. And as the author of this piece points out, you've probably not seen some skyrocketing adoptions right off the bat, because what research shows is that most women who would have had an abortion want to raise their children. They do not want to put them up for adoption. So setting all that aside for a second, there are definitely legislators who quickly leaped to adoption and foster care legislation as a response to abortion bans, or as a follow-on really to abortion bans. So they are legislators who supported the abortion ban and now are following with packages of sort of, supplemental legislation. We've talked about this on the show before. Tennessee is definitely one of those states where the post-Dobbs legislation is in line with easing the adoption process, and supporting foster care in some way. And so what's interesting to me here is that you have a situation where people with very different perspectives on child welfare and adoption all are kind of agreeing that more kids are going to end up in foster care because of Dobbs. Some because they think the system is geared to punish families for poverty, others because they fear that parents who didn't want another child or a first child will be bad parents. And really, either side of that gives a bit of a whiff of the prognostication problem early in COVID, that with society shut down for months and kids not going to school, there'd be an undetected pandemic of child abuse and neglect, and no data supports that happened. I will share my concern for how foster care could see a significant impact post-Dobbs, and it has to do with exits, not entries into it. And I will say this is entirely right now speculation. I am hardly an expert in this, so just something I'm thinking about. But let's say that there ends up being a not insignificant rise in private adoptions as a result of more moms being forced into the choice between parenting their child or giving them up. Obviously, I know family relationships is another significant factor there, but given that choice between parenting or giving a child up to adoption, this would mean an increase in the number of newborn children available for adoptive parents in the private arena, and there is no child more coveted for adoption than a new one. Now that could decrease the interest in adopting children from foster care. And the population within foster care that will be most affected by that decline, I would guess, would probably be young children who are not newborns. So think toddlers all the way up, let's say, to 5 years old. One of the most tragic stats in all of child welfare is that children become statistically unlikely to be adopted at the ripe old age of 8. So if we have more kids turning 8 or thereabouts in foster care, that's less kids that might be adopted. And that would mean less children exiting foster care, thus increasing the size of the system, even if entries just stay about the same, right? Because you're not releasing as many children to a form of permanency, whether it's adoption or reunification or anything. So even if you just have the same number of kids coming in, that's going to increase it. By the way, that is far from unsolvable. We can work hard at improving reunification services so that, like we just talked about in the last segment, reunifications go up, more kids go home. We can do a much better job at finding long-term supported stays with kin. We can scale up, programs like Wendy's Wonderful Kids that specialize in finding permanency for older youth. You Gotta Believe is another great program that does that. And we can just take less kids into foster care for other reasons. So there's certainly solutions to not having a future that is destined to include some huge rise in foster care as a result of the Dobbs decision and abortion bans or any other reason. All right, when we come back, our interview with Angela Orkin of the Children's Law Podcast.
The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, councilforkids.org, and at our 46th National Child Welfare Law Conference this August.
All right, time for another SafeCamp Spotlight interview. All summer, we are bringing in hosts from SafeCamp's inaugural group of member podcasts. You can check out all these podcasts at safecampaudio.org, and we are regularly promoting and featuring their work on social media. You can follow us on any of the big ones at SafeCamp Audio. Today, we have Angela Orkin, co-host of the great Children's Law podcast. Angela, thanks for jumping on with me.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting together SafeCamp Audio.
You're the first person I asked because I think I definitely am aware of some podcasts, particularly in the adoption space, that have been going on for quite a while. But I think you guys were the first ones that I knew doing a foster care podcast. You're probably aware of others, but I think you're the first one I came across.
Well, we certainly knew there wasn't one on the legal side because we had all looked for it, and we know other people had looked for it. So that was kind of the impetus for getting going. But yeah, I think there are a few people doing things here and there, but a lot of folks dip in and then dip right back out. So yeah, we've been at it about almost 4.5 years now. So.
All right, well, let's get these guys to know you and the show. We're going to start with you. This is rules for any guest on our podcast. You got to give me one favorite, Angela. The categories are TV show or movie, sports team, musical group, or book. You can give me more than one, but you have to give me one of them. What do you got?
Okay, so one in each category or just one of those?
You can give me one in each category if you'd like, but you just have to give me one.
All right, I'm trying to think of something outside of the field because I just tend to read and watch a lot of things. All right, I am going to say that one of my favorite shows is actually American Greed. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I haven't.
It is fascinating, and the reason it's fascinating to me is because I am a rule follower by every standard there is, and watching how people go from running a legitimate business to like crossing the line to just these massive frauds is fascinating to me.
Not to delve too far into your own psyche, Angela, but it's very interesting. Like as a rule follower, you're now in a space. Well, maybe you disagree with me, but it seems like this is a corner of the law where there's quite a bit of gray area, right? It's not as clear cut. So that must be both fascinating and just drive you crazy as a person who's like, I want rules to follow, and that's how I live my life.
You know, it's interesting. I think the difference is that when I'm living my own life, my day-to-day, I'm very much a rule follower. But when I'm an advocate, it's different because now I'm fighting for somebody else. And in that case, I can really push people. I can talk to policymakers. It's a lot easier for me to really push those boundaries when it's not on behalf of myself, when it was on behalf of my client. So yeah, nice. It's a little different that way.
Well said. Well said. All right. So describe the Children's Law podcast in 3 sentences or less for people.
So the Children's Law podcast is a podcast designed for children's lawyers that covers a whole ton of different areas. Our primary focus is on how to get kids home faster. I would also say that although it's designed for children's lawyers, many of the topics are relevant to a broader audience in child welfare.
I fully agree with that as a non-lawyer who listens to everyone. Although I haven't gotten to what happens when things go sideways, the new episode.
It's an interesting one.
It's just out on Spotify and wherever you get your podcast, and also shameless promotion on SafeCamp Audio. So tell listeners about your co-host, because you're one of a triad, right?
Correct. Yes, our podcast is brought to you by True North Child Advocates, which consists of myself and then John and Jim Walsh, who created the Foster Children's Project in West Palm Beach. They're one of the few children's law offices that have a study that shows that they were able to get kids home, get kids out of foster care significantly faster. And so we work together. I've done a lot more systemic work. And so the three of us kind of came together and have collected all of our experiences to create a practice philosophy around getting kids home faster.
Yeah. And just for listeners that have heard us talk quite a few times in the past on this show about parent representation and some of the research out of New York City, where there's a lot of really robust interdisciplinary law offices, they got to come up with a better name. That's too ILO, whatever.
Agreed.
I don't want to overstate it, but what they built in West Palm Beach is the child analog of that. They really have set the bar, I think, right, for child representation.
I think what's different about them is that they've been at this for over 20 years doing this work, but also they were able to create an office for that purpose. The purpose was to reduce the time kids spent in foster care. So they tested a lot of different strategies over the years. And so that's what we're able to bring to people. We think a lot about, there's so many attorneys representing kids out there that are contract attorneys or panel attorneys and don't even do this work full time. And they're figuring it out on their own, even today, as far as our profession has come. And so we really enjoy bringing together all those years of experience and kind of giving it in 20 and 30-minute segments so that people can do it on their commute, and give it and for free. It's an easy resource.
When did you guys start the podcast and how did it come about? Like, what were the early conversations?
Yeah. So our first episode was at the end of 2018. We really I have known John and Jim for a number of years, back since about 2005. And we've always enjoyed working together. And I have always really wanted to see if what they've done could be replicated. And so we've been trying to figure out different ways to work together. The idea of a podcast came up. We looked around. We didn't see anything. And I think the other part of it was, I remember when I did represent kids, I was in a children's law office and I could just walk down the hall and plop down in a chair and just say like, oh, I have this case. What do you think? And so many lawyers don't have that. So we tried as best we can to kind of give that very casual, regular language talk so people can feel like they're sitting down with us and talking through cases.
You guys do a great job of that. I'll pay you that compliment. You very
Thank
rarely descend into acronyms, which I certainly screw up more, which is like, I think that's like the cardinal sin of talking about this stuff. Once you start dropping letters, especially if like you're in a state and you just assume all the rest of us know those states' letters.
And I've worked in multiple states, so I try to use the more general terms. And also people, every state law is different on how you represent kids. And so we're trying to keep it high level because really the problems are the same in most states. You see it, I've been in 4 states now, and it's you think they're completely different, and sadly you just see the same things again and again.
What are the 4 states? So Georgia, I know, and Utah.
Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania is where I represented kids. It was at the very start of Kids Voice. At the time, it was Legal Aid for Children, and now we moved out to the mountains, so I'm in Utah.
That's an interesting collide, man. You have a really interesting perspective on child welfare. With those, a fully privatized system, a very county strong one in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Georgia's also county based.
And so many counties. I'm learning a little bit.
159.
So many counties.
Yeah.
By comparison, California's got like 50. It's 3 times as big.
Yeah.
So, Angela, what is your favorite podcast overall? And what's your favorite other podcast kind of in this lane that deals with like youth and family issues?
So favorite podcast of ours?
No, well, I'm going to get to that. Don't worry.
Overall favorite podcast.
So, yeah, okay. Trying to get at your motivations, your influences here.
Okay, favorite podcast overall is kind of more on the personal side. I really love the Rich Roll podcast. He's an interesting guy, a lot about personal transformation, and I feel like what we're all doing and what we're asking people to do is do things completely differently. And so I love to learn how people overcome really big challenges. So I really enjoy his podcast. I would say favorite podcast in this space. I'm going to give it to you guys.
Because,
I am. I like the breadth of what you cover. And yeah, definitely.
If more than 2 other people say me, I'm going to cut this question out.
Okay.
That's really self-serving, but I'll keep you.
Okay.
Okay. So going to where you were headed, I'm not going to make you alienate any particular guest you had by forcing you to pick a single favorite episode of the Children's Law Podcast. But I'll ask it this way. Which episode stands out to you as the particular, embodiment of what you're trying to do with the show?
I'm going to pick one that the 3 of us did, because when we started, the idea was distilling the practice into actionable steps. And I'm going to pick one of our more recent ones, which is around finding permanency for older youth. Over the 4 years that we've been doing this, we go to the NACC conferences, we talk to folks there, and what people had asked for again and again is what do we do, with older youth and the challenges that come with that. And so that was really our attempt to address that. And we got a really quick response in terms of listeners to that episode. So I think we need to keep talking about it. I think a lot of people are struggling in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research and action going on in that space. And, lawyers should definitely be at the table. I'll ride for another one. Also, I really thought one of the more recent episodes with Emma Hetherington about sex trafficking was really just fascinating. And I think that's another very timely thing as we see, the Family First Act kind of carved out that space for using residential care for kids who have experienced that type of thing. I think as one of your former states performance is suggesting, that may come to a boil. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, I think Emma's perspective has really kind of informed my own. And we work so hard to keep kids safe, keep kids safe, and not really address the underlying issues and not giving them a place that they want to be. And kids can run from anywhere. I mean, we know this. So Professor Hetherington is really something else. So we enjoyed that one as well.
Can I ask you a couple topical questions? You got time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do my best.
Here's just what's on my mind. So in 2018, as you guys were launching, probably the same day, honestly, because you guys came out, the first episode was in December, I think.
I think that's right, yeah.
The federal government quietly starts letting states start drawing federal money to help pay for parent and child counsel and child welfare for the first time, which kind of is a big deal, but it really wasn't a part of law. It just was sort of like a policy change. Have you noticed a change at all since then on the youth representation side?
Well, thank you for the softball, because I do. I actually do a lot of. Yeah. I do. The consulting work I do is actually in that space, and in Georgia, I have been helping them access the 4E funds. And in starting that, I did some research and talking to other states, and because everybody's doing it differently, it's having different effects. Some folks moved quickly to get the money in and send it out without really figuring out how it was going to be utilized. Georgia used a very strategic approach, which was bringing it into one county, really working with it, actually transitioned from a contract model to a children's law office. And we've been working on that for a number of years and seeing what the impacts are. So I think it really depends on how the states utilize the funds. Raising rates is really needed, but that alone will not change practice. And we know that from experience. So I think a lot of it has to do with how states work with the counties or other entities and how that's going to be rolled out. I think it absolutely can, because as we know, we're not paying people enough to really stay. And in this market, being able to do that along with some quality improvement initiatives can really have an impact.
All right, last one. I'll get you out of here on this. Very ethereal. What are you most optimistic about, and what concerns you the most about child welfare at this moment?
Starting with optimism, because that's kind of my default. I do see that we've made tremendous strides. I've been in the field for 23 years. And when I think about where we started and where we are, I think the field has made just significant strides. As I say that, in the work that I do on the ground, I still see things that do at times look like, when I represented kids, I had over 500 clients, and I thought that was over. And I kid you not, I spoke to someone recently who had 500 clients. So I think it's a consistency problem. And I think that's where, as David said in my most recent interview, instead of just resisting and getting frustrated, we all just have to lean into it and keep troubleshooting, use this 4E money state by state to get to these places where they haven't been part of this wave of improvement that we've seen over the last 20 odd years.
Angela Orkin of the Children's Law Podcast. Thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Angela Orkin of the Children's Law Podcast for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the SafeCamp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or SafeCamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christina Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, super easy, just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.